Without further ado, I want to introduce Alex McKinnon. He's the Director of the Research Department of the Canadian National Office of the Steelworkers. He's going to present on the pension plan. You don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from Alex.
Thanks. I'm going to try to run through a number of things. I'm going to go through some of the slides quickly. We may skip over some of the slides at the end. I'm sort of cognizant that we only have a little less than an hour to go through stuff. I see this as more as being sort of interactive, that you may have a lot of questions. The other thing is that I know that when people come into a meeting on pensions, you come in with a lot of different expertise and knowledge about the subject. And so some of you will have a whole lot of knowledge about pensions, and others will just say, am I going to get my pension when I retire? And that's all you want to know, as you nod your head. And so what I'm going to try to do is try to go through and explain a bunch of the terms and try to make everything sort of understandable as I can. I'm going to go through quickly. The director sends a message. It's up there. So what I want to talk about is a couple of things. I want to talk a little bit about the committee structure that sort of governs your pension plan. I want to talk about your pension plan. I want to give you some stuff that's going on within the sector. So in the broader public sector, there are a number of things that are happening. I want to talk about CAT. I'll explain that one later. I've got some economic indicators if we get time to do that, to sort of show you where the economy is going and stuff. And then questions. By the way, if you got questions as I'm going along, as long as we don't get bogged down in questions during the presentation, if you got an easy question, I'll just fire it off. All clear as mud? Yep. Okay. There's just so you know that there is a pension committee that sort of governs your plan. It was structured as a result of a faculty interest arbitration. I went through a couple of years of trying to set out what the parameters are. And so it established something called the pension committee. But it's not the only thing that's responsible for your pension plan. There is the investment advisory committee that sort of looks at some of the investments. There's the business board that makes decisions. The board of governors has the ultimate responsibility. And I should add in there somewhere, UTAM fits in there somewhere as well. Everybody recognizes who UTAM is. Just so you know that there are a number of appointees to this committee. And this committee is really important because it's sort of the fundamental committee that sort of governs your pension plan. There's 11 appointees by the governing council, and then there's 9 employee representatives. So there's 4 that are from faculty. There's 1 retiree that's from faculty. Your steelworker local gets to appoint 2. The CUPE gets to appoint 1 person, and then there's also 1 person from sort of the non-union groups. There's a chair and a vice chair on this committee. It rotates every 2 years. The new chairs, the former chair was a former faculty professor, George Lusty, if some of you may know. His term ended, so there's a new vice chair from the governing council side, Claire Kennedy. And starting this time, the faculty actually came to me and asked me if I would be the vice chair. And so I now take over the position as vice chair on that pension committee for the next 2 years. Your local also has another appointee to the board, Philip Merton. He was here last time. I don't see him. If Philip's here. Now this committee is the one that's responsible for overseeing a whole pile of stuff around your pension plan, including sort of selecting sort of the strategy on investments through the statement of investment policies and goals. It looks at the actuarial evaluations, all the financial numbers, a whole pile of things. It doesn't pick the stocks. That sort of gets done through a little bit through the investment advisory committee, and then that stuff goes to UTAM, and UTAM is the one that sort of picks the individual investments and decides where to go. We sort of set the parameters. So it's a fundamental committee in the role of what happens with your pension plan. A little bit about your pension plan. Your pension plan is called a defined benefit. It's a contributory plan, and it's a final average plan. And so what that means is that when you go to retire, and most of you may know this, is that when you retire, you take a look at your best 36 months. They may be your last 36 months for some people. It may have been just prior to retirement. It could be, but it's near the end of your working life. You take a look at your best 36 months of earnings. and you average that out into a year's earnings. You multiply that by up to the YMPE. The YMPE is the Canada Pension Year's Maximum Pensionable Earnings. This year it's 52,500. So up to that point, you would multiply it by 1.6, and then any earnings that you have above that, you'll multiply it by 2%, and that gives you your pension benefit. Everybody knows all that? Good. So now we're going to get into some of the more technical stuff. Because it's a defined benefit plan, your employer is responsible for funding this plan less what the contributions that we put in. And I say we because all the different groups contribute slightly different amounts, but all the employee groups contribute into the pension plan. And so what happens here, we're going to get to some of these terms. For this year, for 2014, you've got earnings for this year. And so when you retire, when you're 67 or 68 or 69, you're entitled to a benefit at that point in time, or unless you want to go earlier. And so for the benefit that you earn for this year, the cost of that is something called the current service cost or the normal cost. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot. That's very important. And so right now, the current service cost for your plan, just so you get some idea of these numbers, is almost $141 million a year for the university. Out of that, the employees contribute about $51 million, and the university contributes another $89 million. So those are not small numbers. So, and then what happens is that every 3 years or sooner, in your case, there's what's called an actuarial evaluation, and it's done every single year. And so every single year they take a look at assets and liabilities, and they say, how much have I got in the bank? How much do I owe? And they do that in 3 different views. You would think all numbers add up to the same. They don't. They take a look at this thing in 3 different ways. They take a look at it as an ongoing basis or a going concern. That's sort of comparing what the pension plan looks like today. And then they take a look at something called the solvency and the wind-up. They're very similar, but it says what happens is if the university shuts its doors and closes up shop and goes away. Is there enough money to pay your pension plan? And solvency, as you may know, we're going to talk about that. That's sort of the elephant in the room. That's the thing that's driving a lot of the discussion in the province, in private sector and public sector pensions. So we're going to talk about the normal cost. It takes a look at the assets and liabilities. If you have more assets and liabilities, you've got a surplus. If you've got more liabilities than you do assets, it's a deficit. And then if there's a deficit, the employer is responsible for paying 100% of that deficit, and they're required to do that over a period of time. And so you would ask yourself, is there a deficit in the plan? Well, there's a small deficit of about $1 billion right now. And so as of July 31st, 2013, there is about $2.8 billion worth of assets that are invested in the market. But the pension plan owes to you $3.8 billion. And so there's almost $1 billion that it's short. And so what happens is that the employer now says that $1 billion, $955 million, it says we've got to take a mortgage out and we've got to pay that. And so what they do is they take a mortgage out and they fund it over a 10, 12, 15-year period. And so what they're required right now to put in is on top of their money that they're putting in, the $89 million that they put in for the pensions that you earn this year, they're also required to put in an additional $63.5 million. So those are big chunks of change. If you add that two together, you start to get into some of the operating budgets of some of the smaller universities. So they're not insignificant numbers. Let me get a drink. Any questions so far? All clear as mud. Give you some idea of what's happened to the assets in the plan and sort of why there's a deficit. There's a number of reasons why there's a deficit. You can see that the pension plan sort of continued to grow until 2008. And in 2008 and 2009, the plan went for a dump. Probably if you had money invested in RSPs, it went for a crash. Every pension plan had the same problem, is that they lost money. That was when first of the stock market crashes. There was a second stock market decline in 2011 that also impacted your pension plan. And so you see now in 2013, we've got slightly less assets than we did before 2007, and we should continue to be growing. In fact, in 2013, it should be $1 billion higher than that. And so that's the stock market crash took a lot of the assets out of the plan. And the employer is now responsible for putting that money back in addition to the benefits that you earn every single year. And you can see, I should have done the chart out to way over here. Because if you would have looked back in the 1990s, all the bars were on the top. There was a huge surplus. And during that time, and there's a lot of controversy about it, the employer was taking a lot of contribution holidays. And contribution holidays are where they say, I got a surplus, so I got a whole pile of extra money in my pocket, and I owe this much money this year, so instead of putting that money in, I'll just reduce the surplus. That's called the contribution holiday. So they actually didn't put hard, cold cash into the plan. But since 2003, a number of things have happened. There's been a decline in interest rates. There was the stock market crash, and you can see that where it hit in 2008, 2009. And also there's another problem in here is that people happen to be living too long, because the longer you live, the more expensive your pensions get, which is a good thing in some ways, but if you were to take up smoking again and die sooner, the pension costs would actually come down. By the way, that's actually driving pension costs, giving up smoking. But you can also see, because somebody asked me somewhere, in one of the committees somewhere, it asked me what's the rate of returns. The pension plan generally does relatively well. It doesn't invest in the market the same way you or I do, but it does, on the whole, generally well. And in some years, they do terribly bad. So in 2008, they lost, or 2009, the way they report these years, by the way, these are all as of July numbers, so it's half of 2008, half of 2009. You know, they lost almost 30%. Most of the pension plans lost less than that, probably in the neighborhood of 20 or 23%, so they lost more. This was also, by the way, a change, so you know, just as a, sort of a sidebar note, this is a change in UTAM. Everybody know what UTAM is? UTAM was created a number of years ago, called the University of Toronto Asset Management Corporation. And so what they said is that we're going to create this sort of corporation that's over in the Mars Center. And they're going to do all of our investing. And so we're going to put all of our pension fund money in. We're going to put our endowment fund money in. And then we're going to let sort of what we think are professionals invest it. And the problem is that the people that they hired may not have been the right people for the job, we'll say that. And they invested in a whole lot of stuff that they were not able to even get out of. So into private equity markets that were not very liquid, not very transparent, and so that when the stock market crash hit, they couldn't get out of those things fast enough. And in fact, we're still left with a bunch of those legacy issues, and we're slowly reducing it. Yes? The investment strategy itself is determined by something called the Statement of Investment Policies and Goals and Procedures. That's done by the pension committee, so that's us. Okay. That there goes to UTAM, and UTAM says if we're allowed to have 70% of equities, and out of those equities, 10% could be alternative investments like hedge funds or other stuff, they administer that. So they pick out which hedge funds, they pick out what stocks to buy, because we're not experts in doing that stuff. Right. But we determine the sort of overall strategy of where we want sort of the risk profile of the plan to be.
Okay. Has that changed since 2008?
It changes slightly every year, but there's not drastic moves in the statement of investment policies. You don't react wildly to one thing or another. Yeah. But in 2008, they got rid of the old UTAM board, and there's a new UTAM. And so things have been changing, although they get stuck with a legacy problem, and some bad rap. Now, whether they're any better than the other ones, time will tell. But generally, things seem to be getting better. And one of the things that myself and some others on the board have been working on is making sure that when UTAM reports back to us, that they're a lot more transparent in what they're doing. And so we're continuing to evolve that. You can also see, remember the market of where the deficits were in 2012, 2011, 2012, there was another stock market decline, and they just basically broke even. The problem with these is that when you break even, 2014 hasn't been reported yet, that's why it's zero. But when you have low numbers like this, you got to remember that the pension plan every year has to make about 6.25% or 6.5% in order to stay ahead of the game. So no matter what, it has to make a certain return to stay afloat. And so when you have a pension investment return of less than 1%, not only you lose money, I should say back over here, not only did you lose 27.5%, but the plan didn't make the 6.5% that it was supposed to, so the loss, the pension plan feels that even worse. But that's only one of the problems that we have. There's more. You're sorry that you asked for another meeting. So besides the going concern, we start to take a look at what happens, like I said, if the university shuts its doors. Most of us think that a university will never shut its doors. There have been some limited cases in Canada where that's happened. We know that in places back in the 80s, they said about Stelco and they said about GM, they're too big to fail. If you take a look at Stelco, if you drive over the Burlington Skyway, where there used to be 12,500 people in the plant, there's 600 now. And so one thing is always never say never. And so what the university is required to do by law is they're required to say, let's compare the assets and liabilities, and you would think, how can things change? But when you're doing a solvency or wind-up, and they're fundamentally the same, a couple of small differences, you're now required to say, what happens if I wind this up, and what are the changes that I have to make? Well, now you have to use the current interest rate. We all know when we've gone to get a loan or what a mortgage is, what our interest rates are. They're very low. So every time we've got it renewed our mortgage and we're getting mortgage rates for 4% or whatever, those are extremely good for us when we're borrowing. They suck if you're a pension administrator, because the lower the interest rate goes, the higher your liabilities go. And so you change the interest rates by 1%, and your liabilities can jump by 18%, and you haven't done anything to the plan. And so what a solvency and a wind-up does is it says, now let's compare the assets to liabilities, but let's value those liabilities as if on the current marketplace and what's happening. And the picture changes a little bit. We talked about that. Oh, by the way, the other thing is if you compare the assets on a solvency or wind-up basis, and it's the solvency one that we're really concerned about, that technical term. If you compare the solvency assets and the liabilities, if you've got a deficit, that deficit isn't paid over 12 or 15 years anymore. It's paid off over 5. If you went and got a mortgage on your house and you paid it off over 5 instead of over 15, what happens to your payment? It goes right through the roof. Sort of more than doubles. So just to give you some idea of the numbers, on a solvency basis, you still got your almost $3 billion of cash in the bank, if you will. But now what you owe on a solvency basis now jumps up to $4.2 billion on a solvency basis. Like I say, that's really the important number. If you did a wind-up, so the place actually did shut down, they would actually owe about $6 billion. So now this deficit over here of an additional $1.3 billion, they're required to pay that off over 5 years. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of payment. That's a lot of cash going out the door. And that's the one that everybody in the post-secondary institutions are complaining about. And so they've been meeting with the government. They've been doing all kinds of stuff. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Any questions about this stuff so far? Clear as mud. So if you may not recall, because this gets into some of the more technical stuff, a couple of years ago, when everything was really bad, all the universities went to, through their employer group called the COU, which is the Coalition of Universities, went to the government, they lobbied the government to say, we shouldn't have to fund on solvency. All the private sector has to fund on a solvency basis. So if they've got a solvency deficit, they've got to pay it off over 5 years. And so they went and they said, we're the universities, we don't have to pay that. And the government said, you know what, we're really not sure about this. In fact, we're quite sure that we're not going to give you that exemption. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a different threshold for universities, a different system of paying off your deficit. So they created something called a stage 1 and a stage 2. And so what stage 1 says is that the university drafted, all the universities did that, almost all of them, drafted a proposal that said, how are we going to screw the members? And then stage 2 is that go after it and get it in bargaining. And then at the end of stage 2, which will be at the end of July 31st of 2014, once they do the valuation, they're going to apply to the government to get an extended period of solvency funding for 10 years. Now, they haven't been solvency funding for the last 3, so they got out of paying that money. And they've got a year to do the valuation, and then they'll have 10 years. So they'll have, in essence, 14 years to have paid off that deficit. Oh, yeah.
When does the solvency actually happen? What are the circumstances? Are we in that stage now, or does something have to
You're in a solvency deficit now. The solvency deficit is something that you do, every time you do a valuation, you do that solvency valuation. Okay. And you're required to look at the deficit as if the plan shuts down. Okay. The only difference is that the university sector has not been paying any payments towards that. So they've given this stage 1 and the stage 2 solvency. Now going through the stage 2, what they said is they created this complicated mathematical formula that only the actuaries can figure out. And what it meant roughly is that from every bargaining unit group, didn't matter which university you were in, they needed to extract another 2.5% from the employees. So they needed the employee contributions to go up by 2.5%, and the employer contributions would drop. So this is the way the government goes after, for you to pay off some of the deficit without them having to fund the universities anymore. And you say politics don't matter. It does.
Excuse me.
Yep.
What percentage of the total deficit does that 2% represent?
Not very much, because your contributions right now are $60 billion at 6%. Well, it's hard to say. I'd be pulling a number out of the air. I could take a look after, but it doesn't represent.
Be less than 5%.
Yeah, it doesn't represent a huge amount of money. All it does is that 2.5%, and in fact, I'll come to the figures a little bit later. Well, all it does is it drops the employer's cost down and it drives yours up. And so while the employer pays roughly, I'm going to go out on a limb, I can check the numbers, so don't quote me on this. If it's being recorded, don't quote me. They pay for every dollar you put in, they pay about $1.30 or so, $1.29, something like that. And so all that will do is sort of lower the amount that they pay in, and yours will go up.
But in the end, the 2% is more symbolic in terms of actually attacking the insolvency
it's a way for the government to say the employees should pay more for the deficit. And the reason they should pay more and why they wanted a 2.5% increase will come up in another slide, I think. By the way, they did change the regulation just a little while ago that said now a university, instead of funding it over the next 10 years, can do it over 7. So they give them another 3 years of extension of not having to put any money in. So under this regulation, for example, the University of Guelph just elected to do this. And that's just, it's sort of like taking an interest-only payment on your loan for the first 3 years, and so stuff builds up, and then you got to pay a much higher payment at the end. Kind of a stupid idea, but this is, going back to your 2% question, what happened is that prior to the stage 1 and stage 2, what the government did is it introduced some metrics in August of 2010. And it said there was a huge problem within the broader public sector. There are big deficits. The government's looking and saying, universities all crying for more money. And so they introduced these metrics, and they said to the universities, here's what you got to do in order to get your solvency exemptions. You have to convert to a jointly sponsored pension plan, a JSPP. You have to move to a 50-50 co-share. And I'll come back to that because it comes up a couple slides more. But you have to get to a 50-50 co-share. And so the universities have been doing that. And so there's a mandate by the government to get to a 50-50 co-share. You can read between the lines what the employer's proposal will likely be a bargain. They said you can eliminate or reduce benefits, and in some universities, they've given up or rolled back some of the unreduced early retirement provisions. And they also said that you can make some benefits conditional upon the performance of the plan. So if you've got indexing, taking that out, and you only pay it if the plan is in a surplus or has a good year, or some condition upon the performance of the plan. The big thing for us are those first two things, converting to a jointly sponsored pension plan and moving to a 50-50.
Alex, just
Yeah.
a question.
Yep.
All those 4 points, the university doesn't have to meet all 4, do they? It's something that the government wants to see them address in one of those areas.
Yeah. I should say there was actually a 5th point, and that was switching over to a defined contribution or a group RSP. And there certainly wasn't any appetite for that. Just to give you some idea for sort of what's gone on a regulatory sort of view, so they set out these stage 1, stage 2 solvency things. They said in their budget in 2012, they said we expect the broader public sector to move to 50-50 co-share within 5 years. It's 2014. That's 2 years. That's 3 years left that they need to get towards a 50-50 co-share. They also said it in their 2000 budget. They said it in the 2014 budget. And like I said, that 2013 is when they extended the solvency. This move to a jointly sponsored pension plan has been a big issue. And if you go to the budget and Schedule 26, there's a whole pile of regulations that now allow universities to move to a jointly sponsored pension plan. The other thing that's been happening is there is the university group, the COU, has been meeting for a number of years. The government has been funding your employers by hundreds of thousands of dollars to get together to talk about pensions. And once in a while, in the beginning, they used to invite us for a meeting and spout out some stuff, and then we would leave. And so what happened was when the government started to introduce these metrics in 2010, the unions that were involved formed this thing called the COUU, which is a coalition of university unions. And so we went after the government, and it took a couple of years, and we said, we want some funding for the unions to take a look at pension issues in the broader public sector. And we finally got one phase of funding, $135,000. The restriction was that we had to, and the government, and the restriction for the employers' money as well, because they got a second round of funding, was that you had to take a look at what a jointly sponsored pension plan would look like in the sector. Because the government has a desire to move people to a jointly sponsored pension plan. there was a joint working group that was set up. So Ministry of Finance and MTCU were there. And so I went to a whole lot of these meetings, and they brought in people like Jim Leach, who was the former head of the Teachers Pension Plan. They brought in Harry Arthurs, who was the head of the Expert Commission. They brought in all kinds of people to talk about pension issues within the broader public sector. And then what's happened, and we're going to talk about this in a second, is something called CAT. Everybody know what CAT is? CAT is a jointly sponsored pension plan, and it's called the College of Applied Arts and Technology. So if you've got friends or family or something that works in a college, whether they're administrative staff or whether they're faculty, they all belong to this jointly sponsored pension plan called CAT. And what CAT's been doing is going around and meeting with a number of universities. They are the smallest of the jointly sponsored pension plans. Everybody's familiar with the Teachers Pension Plan. That's a jointly sponsored pension plan. HOOP, the Healthcare of Ontario, is another major jointly sponsored pension plan. And there are only a few of them in Ontario. There's not very many. They're generally all big, and except for CAT. CAT's one of the smallest. You can see it's only got $7.1 billion, so it's only about twice as big as the University of Toronto pension plan. It was started a long time ago, and it was done by the colleges, sort of by the, who were the employer, and by OPSEU. And in 2013, what happened was because the government said you should be moving to a jointly sponsored pension plan, they seen some light here. And so what they started to do was to go out and they started to talk to specific universities. Now, Trent University in Peterborough has a major, major problem. They were ready to go literally bankrupt. And so CAT went to them and cut a deal with them and said, look, as long as we get all the government regulations, which, by the way, are in Schedule 26 of the new budget, you can move all of your existing pension plan, which is a defined benefit like ours, into this jointly sponsored pension plan. And so they've got a deal with Trent to do that. They recently proposed it at Queen's. We went to a meeting with Queen's a little while ago, I guess in the late fall last year. And lo and behold, CAT has been meeting with the employer there for some time. And they've now called all the employee groups in, and we participated in the meeting and said, by the way, we want you to join CAT. And we said, no. We said, if you're going to do this, you'll raise it in bargaining. One of the reasons why is because they just wanted us to join CAT, and it's the second line. The contribution rates for CAT are 11.2% up to the YMP, so up to $52,000, you'd be paying 11.2, and it's 14.8% above. The benefit rate is only 1.3%. So you remember yours is, your pension is calculated as 1.6% of your earnings up to the YMP. CAT is only at 1.3%. Now they do have a bridge benefit and they've got some indexing, but for most of our members, this may be attractive to faculty in a number of areas because of the indexing and other stuff. But for most of our members, you take a huge hit, and your contributions right now are only 6.8% and 8.4% above the YMP. So that would mean like a 5% jump in your contributions. The problem is that CAT has been going around. They've now met with a whole pile of universities. At Guelph, we've been notified that it's going to be on, we're presently in bargaining, haven't got the monetary, but we've been told that they're going to be proposing that we join CAT, which we said no, unofficially. We'll say it officially soon. Not quite as nice as that. But what's going to happen is that I think, is that CAT, like I say, has gone around and has found a whole lot of favorable universities because as soon as they join the jointly sponsored pension plans like CAT and HOOP and OMERS and the Teachers Pension Plan, they don't have to fund on a solvency basis. So the employers don't give a shit about us, to be quite frank. Even though our contributions will jump up by 5%, they get out of their solvency payments, and so that makes them happy regardless of what happens to us. And we've said, you know, we're not interested in that proposal. What we have said and what's been going on sort of behind the scenes is that there has been a lot of discussion about a sort of a multi-employee sector-wide jointly sponsored pension plan just for the university sector, but that's very slow to get going, and it hasn't got a lot of traction at the moment. But there is an interest by both the government and by a number of universities to move towards a jointly sponsored pension plan. And like I say, the one place that CAT has not come to is to the University of Toronto. Yeah, so we've talked about that. We'll talk about pensions. By the way, I'm just going to flip through these real fast. So an economic sector update, sort of, you know, what's happening with employment rates. Troy did all these slides for me, so things generally are working out well. The only place that you'll see is the unemployment rate here in Toronto continues to be much higher than anywhere else in the province or in the country. Gross domestic product, you know, generally the economy is doing not too bad. These are two interesting slides, and then we'll get to some questions. This is in Canada, and I'll show one for Ontario, where public sector, these are the wage settlements for public sector versus the private sector. And you can see that in most years, the public sector has wage increases that are much lower or lower than in the private sector. The only place where it does change is in periods where there is a sort of a recession like 2008, where there's some negative settlements or very low settlements in the private sector. Generally, the same experience hasn't been felt. But over a longer period of time, in general, in the private sector, the wage settlements are lower than in the private sector. I think I said that right. And you can see the same thing holds true, is that if you take the data for Ontario, that our settlements tend to be less in the private sector. So when you have these people spouting off in the press about the public sector and the gold-plated pension plans and all the other crap that they spout at us, it's not true. And income inequality grows deeper and deeper in this country. Any questions? Because then I can sit. Yes?
Will you be able to forward that presentation to us?
I'll give a copy to Paul, and then they can figure out how they want to.
Because my understanding is that perhaps the benefit of a jointly sponsored pension plan is that in theory you have a much larger pool of assets, and therefore it's well managed. It's a big if, but if it's well managed, it should do better, it should be able to withstand shocks in the economy better than a smaller. So if there was an opportunity, say, for the universities to put one together that had not the rates of contribution that you were talking about for CAT, but that were more comparable to what we have here, would it make some sense economically to do that?
There may be economic reasons to do that, but there's also political reasons within your university or other universities to decide to go that path or not. And that's not for me to decide. There is a general consensus, although it's not uniform, that the larger the pool of assets, the better the return that you can get. Ontario Teachers Pension Plan shows that because they're able to invest in stuff that absolutely most other plans cannot invest in. So if you actually take a couple of the large pension plans and the Canada Pension Plan around the world, they're called the Maple Revolutionaries, and they're able to do things that other governments in a lot of countries cannot do, because they can invest in a lot of infrastructure projects and things that small plans, even our plan, even with the $3 billion that we have in assets in the University of Toronto pension, is still a small number in the overall scheme of things. Yep.
I think it's been great to get a bit of a sense of the landscape of the situation that we're in. I'm just wondering if we've got any kind of ideas of prognosis in an environment where going into bargaining, the university is going to be looking to increase the employee contribution, decrease the university, and perhaps move towards opportunities to eliminate their solvency requirements. What we might be facing and what we're looking at timeframes in terms of into the future, what we should be anticipating may be happening.
I think the writing's on the wall with respect to the contribution rates. The government has said they want 50-50 co-share on the contributions. And so that's that.
That's just gonna happen.
That's, in my view, and I don't want to, you know, we're at the bargaining table with the employer, we're going to tell them to take a hike. But that is, last time when they set the stage 1 and stage 2, they said you got to meet the savings targets of 2.5%. I don't care what union flag, association, who you were, everybody in the province took and got a 2.5% increase in their contribution. Roughly, some were 2.25, some were 2.5. Everybody got that. And so I couldn't sit here and say that they're not going to pressure very, very hard to get to 50-50. They are, in all of my information with other bargaining unit groups, both within this campus and other campuses where they're already in bargaining, the university is making the pitch to go to 50-50 all across the sector. So I don't think you ought to be surprised what they're going to do in our bargaining. Having said that, they ought not be surprised when we tell them to go take a hike. Because I don't, you know, in my view, and this is not a view that's shared by everybody, I'm a little hard pressed to say why we would pay for half of something and not have a say in the governance. A more effective role, because we're only allowed 9 people. And in a lot of places we have absolutely no say. I can tell you that, and I'll give you a question in a second, I can tell you that if Hudak had been elected, we wouldn't have had this problem. Quite frankly, because you would not have had your pension plan. It would have been gone by now. So, the one place that is not under attack, by the way, are the jointly sponsored pension plans. If Hudak had been elected, he would not have touched the teacher's pension plan or HOOP or any of the other ones, because there's no mileage in it for him. In the broader public sector and the defined benefit plans where there's large solvency deficits, he would have attacked those. And so for me, I see the future. I see that the employer is going to come after you for that. And if you're paying 50-50, then is there some rationale to have the discussion to say we should have more say in the governance? And some unions would say no. Other unions would say yes. Some locals within the union may have different viewpoints, but that may or may not be a discussion you want to entertain at some point.
Sorry, just one
Yeah.
follow-up. It's all relational, of course, so if we're looking at, you know, increases in those ways, of course, we're all reading in the news recently, inflation rates are at 2.4%, just in terms of wage increase, and that relationship it also becomes important in trying to keep from losing too much ground.
Oh. Yeah, I think your bargaining committee will be, and the staff will be keenly aware of that. Yeah. You had a question?
My question is related to early retirement. Is the university offering any special window for early retirement? Like, I mean, if the person's age plus years of service is equals 80 years, does this person have to be 60 to qualify? Like,
Yeah, whatever it is under your plan, I don't know all the details of what your early retirement. Are they offering anything special or more than what they have in your plan? The answer is no. And would they be prepared to entertain that sort of discussion? I could say that they would slam the door in our face to have that kind of discussion, because that's one of the things that drives the solvency liabilities way up. And so the answer is, quite frankly, I don't see that happen. I mean, I don't want to stop you from going after stuff, but I think there's some realization of what things that you may achieve and may not achieve, and changing to get 30 and out, or being able to retire at age 55 with 20 years of service, those things are just not going to happen. You know, I mean, stand to be corrected. You know, I just crunched the numbers for the bargaining committee. They're the ones that have to go after and do that. But the art of asking is a whole lot easier than the art of getting. And I can tell you that this one is going to be almost impossible. Yep.
Alex, can you mention what you mentioned at the committee about the possibility of a 2-tier system that failed at Guelph?
Yeah, there's, after the membership meeting, we, both Meg, I should mention, by the way, there's two of my coworkers here, Meg Inrich and Troy Lumbad, who are here. They'll be assisting me in the bargaining. There was, at the University of Guelph, the last round, they actually, with CUPA, they actually introduced and said, we get out of the defined benefit, go to a defined contribution plan, and that went in real fast. And the employer has not entertained that anywhere else in any of the other groups, nor do I think that they would entertain it here. And in fact, I spoke at a pension symposium of universities just a little while ago, I think it was in May. And one of the things that Western University said and Laurentian said is that we have defined contribution plans. It's a problem for them. People aren't retiring because a lot of their, especially professors and stuff, took a huge hit in 2008, 2010 and 11. And it's just, they're not being able to attract people. And so for a recruiting tool, the defined contribution plan is not very attractive when they're actually out looking for people.
So the idea was that the new hires would be defined?
New hires would go into an RSP, if you will.
And veterans would be grandfathered.
That's right. But that proposal went nowhere. Yep.
Yeah, how tough is the province on having to fund this on the solvency basis? I mean, I would think that their concern would be maybe a smaller university, that if the pension fund became insolvent, that the whole university might become insolvent. But that seems unimaginable in a place the size of U of T. It's such a huge difference in the unfunded liability. Is there any movement on that or any change?
Well, they made some small changes. That's why they said we'll give you the 10-year solvency funding as opposed to the private sector, which gets 5 years. And then we're going to give you some other extensions within that. So they sort of bent over backwards, but they said you're still going to fund on a solvency basis, that you need to do this. Some of the desire by doing this is that if the long-term bond rate, so if you take a look at the 10-year bond rate, if that were to improve, the solvency issue goes away. That's still, by the way, even if the solvency disappeared, that still will not stop the province from going after and saying you're going to move to a 50-50 co-share. Yep.
Who's managing these funds? Like
The funds are all managed by UTAM, which is the University of Toronto Asset Management Corporation. They manage the funds, invest the funds in accordance to the direction that our pension committee sets out for them.
So how do we know that they're, they're qualified? Qualifications, like, because you don't know their history of their management, financial thing. And
they went through we didn't do that, but they went through a hiring process to bring in the present staff, and so they also have a responsibility to report back to the Investment Advisory Committee, and they get grilled constantly by them, by the business board, and by the Board of Governors about the investments, because all the endowment funds are invested by the same people.
Has there been any issue in that?
There was, prior to 2008, there was a huge issue with UTAM. I think some of the people are overpaid. You know, they make a lot of money. Do they do a lot? Do they do a lot of stuff and technical stuff that most of us don't understand? Most of the Board of Governor people don't understand. They do, and they should be rewarded for that. But some of the wages are a little high. Yes.
I would have lost that amount of money for half their salary.
I would have done it for a quarter. But it's also why this pension plan will do better over the long haul than your own RSPs or the defined contribution plans that are like at Laurentian and Western and other places. It will always do better because their strategy for investing in stuff is very different than yours or mine. And so in most of the time, their return will be higher. In some of the bad times, they may take a bigger hit than what you or I would, because their risk tolerances, their time horizons are very much different. And so I think what's important is not to look I know we look at that 2008 number, and it's horrendous compared to other plans. But I think if you set that aside, you know, I think that they do generally well. Because I sit on trustee on other pension plans, and I look at their return, and so they're not far off of the ballpark, either above or slightly below. Yep.
So you may have covered this already, but I'm a little bit unclear about the difference between JSPP's 50/50 co-share proposal and what the contribution share is now.
Okay, in a jointly sponsored pension plan says that it's a jointly governed plan. So 50% of the representatives come from or appointed by or selected sort of by the employee groups, and 50% come from the employer groups. And there's any mechanisms to sort of appoint those boards. In a jointly sponsored pension plan, they can reduce your benefits. So it gets, all the pensions sort of get removed from the bargaining table. And so the board can actually reduce your benefits, but only for future service. Under the law, they can't reduce any past service. And it's 50/50, so you pay half, and the teachers pay half, the school boards pay half. Under our plan, the employer has the ultimate responsibility for funding the plan, and we pay a portion of our earnings towards trying to help fund the plan. But if the deficit goes way up or way down, our contributions would have to change. And then they don't, they have to bargain that. Whereas that stuff gets sort of removed and put over there with a separate board. And so they operate very differently, and sort of the guarantees are very different. Under our pension plan, the Pension Benefits Guarantee Fund in Ontario applies, although it wouldn't have enough money to cover that deficit. And the jointly sponsored pension plans are not part of that guarantee fund. But I don't think we really have to worry. As the University of Toronto, we are also the landlord for Queen's Park. I say we, I spent enough time here. We actually own that land. So, yes.
So if someone were to quit or get laid off well before retirement and they want to cash out their pension, do they just get back their own contributions, or do they also get the university's half?
They get the university's half as well. It's called the commuted value, so it's the value of that promise. So the question was, what happens if I terminate or quit? Do I get the value? And so what an employer is responsible to do is to give you something called the commuted value, which represents the cost of that promise that they're going to owe you at some future point. So that includes both your contribution, you're always entitled to your contributions back, and you get the employer's contribution. It makes up this piece of money that, if it's invested property at the retirement age that you're supposed to retire at, will be enough to pay you what you should get. Yep.
You mentioned with the CAT JSPP that there were bridge benefits and inflation protection.
Yes.
How do they compare to ours?
The bridge benefits and the inflation indexing are better. They generally pay, the problem with CAT is that they have a 6 or 7 step funding regime that sort of moves and can cut off the indexing payments or change your contribution levels depending on where they fit on these funding levels. If everything operates normally, their bridge benefits are better. They have some unreduced early retirement provisions. Their bridge benefits are better, and their indexing has generally paid. They have not paid it, but if the market were to take a crash or interest rates can't go much lower, could have an impact, and they may not pay it. But on those two things, they're generally better. But the problem is that your contributions would jump up by 5% a year, and your pension, because the average person in our bargaining units make $52,500 or less. We've got people that make more, obviously, but the majority, the average of our members make at that level or less. And so that would mean that your pension would go, instead of being 1.6% of your earnings, down to 1.3. So it's a big hit. You pay a lot more for a lot less. There's got to be more questions.
A stupid question.
Yeah.
The
No,
average.
there's no stupid question.
No, it is kind of. The 52K, that's net, not gross, or gross?
That's gross.
That's gross.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
You mentioned in passing in the 90s you were in surplus and the university took the contribution holiday. How much damage did that actually do to the situation? Because I saw at the beginning of the graph, we were already in deficit by 2003.
Yeah.
So shouldn't they have started paying it off way 10 years ago when we were...
Well, they didn't know the deficit, because what that deficit is created in large part by some declines in some of the returns. It's also, it's created by the change in interest rates. Interest rates have a huge impact on that deficit. And so, yeah, the question would be, I mean, it's a debate that you can walk on both sides of the fence on that one. The university will have argued, instead of taking money out of programs, they put it in, you know, they use the contribution holiday, so they were able to put the money somewhere else in the university. And from our side, we'll say that was $100 million that you took out, that would have been worth X now. Yep.
What's the moving forward proposed solution on our side?
That'll be up to your local to tell you where they think that they should go in bargaining. They'll be certainly sitting and talking with us and with the staff about some of the issues and sort of a little more detail about some of the issues that they face, thinking about what the right strategy is. But there are some things, I mean, there should be no secret about where the university may come after.
So if the interest rates continue the way they are for another decade or so, how does the pension going to handle that?
They would have some serious difficulties handling that. But not only this university, anybody that has a defined benefit plan would have a huge problem.
Would that mean that the university is going to go bust or something?
I wouldn't say that. This university is asset rich.
I think you have problems that assets don't value as much as you would think.
Well, the problem is this land would make great condos. And so, you know, I'm sure that there's a bunch of politicians or other people that would like to change Queens Park into a big condo and get rid of it. They are asset rich, and those assets are not likely going to disappear. The land itself, where it is extremely valuable. And if it's not valuable, there is something happening in the economy everywhere, not just in the university. But you should not expect interest rates to sort of go back up to 12 or 14%. Or, you know, there. If they went up by 2%, our mortgages and stuff would go up, but 2% would certainly make life a whole lot easier here. Yep.
I mentioned this in our meeting, Alex, that the business of universities is forecasted to be very healthy. York is building a campus in Markham. I said this in the meeting. Laurier is building a campus in Milton. The new budget says they're going to encourage more campuses to be built. There is the immigration that's happening in Ontario. All the children are going to universities more like them. So there is business for the universities. It's just what they do with those profits, right?
Yeah. Well, I think you got to separate out the two things. There's the sort of the business model about selling their services to individuals, services education. And a large degree of those services are being sold outside the country, and so they're heavily dependent on sort of how do you term that? International students coming in, and so there is a huge contingent. It doesn't matter what university you're in. The other thing on sort of on the asset side, there isn't a university that you don't go to that isn't spending a lot of money building stuff everywhere. Now, that doesn't mean that the business model over here, you would hope, is still going to continue to flourish and grow. There is also, the Ontario government published some papers a while ago, a couple budgets ago, about sort of the move to changing the degree program is sort of trying to shorten it up. So that would mean less people, maybe the same number of people, but less time in a university. It also talked about the internet-based learning. It talked about when we talked to the faculty associations in various places, they see that their sort of class sizes has grown dramatically. So it's the same number of professors per se, but the number of students have increased. So you've got, you're not increasing that way. So to say that the university will never change and the model will continue to always flourish, I absolutely hope so. But, when I drive across the Burlington Skyway and they said too big to fail, and you look at Selco, now it may be a dirty, smelly factory.
Yeah, but if I can interject,
Yeah.
industrial manufacturing, that is a reality has been decreasing in Ontario. Education, human knowledge, and human growth, that's something, if we lose that, we might as well shut down the product. I mean, education is not something we build in a factory. That it was, still was important, but now education has always been and will be for the knowledge.
Education will always be very important. The model and the delivery model, I think that it's not smart to say that it will be exactly the same now as it will be in 10 years. That in my view, it'll be a very different model, and some of that will have an impact on us. We're already seeing in a lot of the universities where they're starting to cut back some of our members. They cut back some of the programs.
We've got those MOOCs coming in now too.
MOOCs?
Massive online,
Yeah.
online courses.
Yeah, there's,
access.
yeah.
And community colleges are offering degrees, so that's got to compete with the universities as well.
Yes.
Sheridan is going towards university, but the immigration, there is still, our former president of Toronto said, UT said we should have 5 universities in the city of Toronto for the amount of demand. So there is bodies that are still coming.
Yeah. And there is. I throw up a caution to say we should never say never. Because it. But yes.
I was just thinking, I hear everybody saying there's lots of money, but the division of how it's applied and everything, are there limitations of how much it goes to pension and then everything else, like, our salary? So on a big picture thing, we can't just say there's a lot of money and then we've got to look at this problem, but we have to look at an overall model, like you're saying, how it's governed and how it's going to be distributed, all the funds and assets and how it's going to be managed, right? So that's what you guys are looking at, right?
Yeah, we're looking at a whole pile of things, but I think that what you'll see from the university is that they're going to continue to say, if we can't fix the pension problem, if you don't do this or you don't do that, we've got to cut programs. And so it's got to come out of programs. Queens has circulated a bunch of publications now where they're sort of attacking us by not joining CAT, by saying this, their increased contributions has to come out of programs. Guelph has said the same thing, even though Guelph is now going to be paying less than what they have been paying.
So they're just saying that this is the pool that they're going to be spending on benefits and also everything else. So they're not going to touch this area of assets. They have lots of this land and all this stuff, and they're not going to touch that part to compensate the deficit here.
Generally, no.
Exactly.
They can take out some letters of credit, and they borrowed some money. They borrowed $150 million to put into the plan. But there is, it's like everywhere else. There's only a finite amount of money, and we want a wage increase, we want changes to a number of things. So it's the bargaining committee has some challenges, and it's not that easy to be on the bargaining committee.
Just out of curiosity, if the worst comes to worst, maybe reach out to Stan, I can't pay off the pension. Where in the line of creditors is the pension plan in terms of secure? Is it a secured liability?
It's down the list, yeah.
It's like, it's going to be the last thing that gets paid out, which is.
Yeah, it's not a secured creditor. And by the way, is that Philip up there?
Yep.
Then Philip is the other, your local nominee to the pension committee as well.
I mean, the other thing that might be said is that the pension committee only exists because the faculty actually caused the university to have it. I mean, and our role is somewhat that of eyes and ears. I mean, there's very little we actually can do. We can make recommendations, make suggestions, but very much I think the point has to do with the Alex making the point again. It really has to be what is negotiated at the bargaining table. It doesn't really matter. Because we can, you know, have in my view is more or less sort of the eyes of the, more exactly the eyes of the executive at some of those committees. So that at least we have some information. But the crunch really comes when the universities and the local bargain for what in fact wage increase, what in fact happens with increases in pensions.
I should say that one of the things that happened in bargaining is that even though you had an increase in your contributions, we were able to negotiate that the employer contributions didn't drop. And so that was the extra money that we put in goes to help fund the deficit. So it wasn't a case of trying to make it was a case of trying to make the plan a little more sustainable in a small way, but it didn't drop the employer's contribution. Every other university, the employer's contributions dropped. Here we bargained that it didn't. It's 2 for 1 day, you get 2 questions, so it's a good discussion line. No more? Oh, yeah.
Are the faculty served by the same pension plan as us? Or do they have
The
faculty?
The faculty are in the same pension plan as we are.
They are.
Yeah. There are a number of universities that only have one pension plan for everybody. Queens is the same way. Guelph has 3 separate pension plans.
So in that pension committee, when you said that there are 4 seats from the faculty, are they wearing the faculty association hat, or are they wearing the university administrative hat?
I can tell you that every single person that sits on the committee doesn't wear their union or association hat. You wear a pension committee hat because our personal assets and ass is on the line, and so you put on a different hat when you sit on a pension committee because you've got a fiduciary responsibility, and so we're very careful about the things that we do.
So they are representing the needs of the faculty.
They're representing the needs of everybody.
Okay.
So the role of the pension committee is to oversee the pension, not to set the surrounding stuff that gets bargained.
Yeah, we do things like we talk about the saving investment policies and goals, and we have to approve that. We have to approve the assumptions that go into the actual evaluation. There are some limits in the power. I mean, this was a big thing, as Philip said, when they sort of allowed us into those hollowed halls of the governing chamber council, and they sort of let us lowly people in to talk about stuff. That was a big change for them. But I would like to think that we've actually tried to make a positive contribution to the pension plan, and I think we have, and we're going to continue to do that. But
Alex, we need to also recommend and note that the majority of the people on the pension committee are appointed by administration.
yes, yeah, because I went through at the very beginning. I said because there's 11 people that are from the board of governors, and we've had to correct some of them. Everybody that wears a hat has a legal responsibility to the plan members and the beneficiaries of that plan. That's who our responsibility is. Not to the university, not to our unions. It is to, in fact, the beneficiaries of that plan. That's our legal obligation. Yep.
So you said that if we join into the CAT program that wanted us to join them, our contributions would rise by 5%. But the university's interest was that they wouldn't have to deal with the solvency issue, right? Did I understand correctly?
That's correct.
So would the university be interested in increasing everyone's salary by 5%? So that the membership will notice the increase in contribution?
I can't speak for the university. I think that they would do, like any other employer would do anything to pay less.
Would that be a silly idea, or would that be something?
So I couldn't hear for that.
Is that a silly idea?
Freezing.
No, we joined CAP, our contribution, the negative to us, the biggest negative to us is that we have to pay 5% more.
Yes.
But the university has another interest in the university joining the CAP program because they wouldn't need to deal with insolvency.
That's correct.
So they could say to alleviate our concerns with joining CAP, we could raise everyone's salary by 5%.
They would actually have to raise it more if you do, the thing is, because it's taxable income, whereas the 5% we pay in now is tax deductible. So they'd have to raise it by, a correspondingly higher amount, but I doubt that they're going to do that, because even if they do, we still want a wage increase on top of that. So let's say we got a 2% wage increase. Now we need 8 or 9%. If we got an 8 or 9% wage increase, you know what the public's going to do to you. Lots of challenges for a bargaining committee. Everybody that thinks being on a bargaining committee is easy, run for one.
I don't think anybody thinks that.
Like you say, CAT would lose a lot of politics and control, the committee that we have, so, and we're a larger portion.
Yeah, that's why CAT's not interested in you. CAT is not interested in, and one of the things that CAT has said is that we'll take in universities, but we will never relinquish more than half of our control. So OPSU and the colleges will always, at the very, no matter how big the assets grow from the university sector, will never give up more than half of the control. That doesn't make any sense either. Now, it's a well-run, well-funded, solid pension plan. I don't want to take anything away from CAT. But it's also one I don't think is appropriate for the university sector. Did we do it within 1 o'clock? I forget what time it is.
No, it's 1:26.
Oh, sorry. I didn't think I'd be able to talk for 20 minutes. Yep.
How much did our contributions go up in the last contract?
Roughly about 2.5%. Everybody's contributions. You had this convoluted savings target, mathematical calculation. The actuaries had to figure it out. And when we met with the government and with Alan Shapiro, the actuary, and other stuff, and went through that, all the universities they calculated were between 2.25% and 2.5%. And that's what everybody gave. Yep.
Is that 2.5% per year, or
No, that's your contributions in this year go up by that 2.5%, and then they stay up for the rest of your life.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you say 2.5%, it's 2.5% from the salary? Or
From salary of your earnings. So if you're making $52,500, your contribution rate is 6.8% of those earnings. And before it was less than that.
From the 4 whatever percent.
Yeah, it was much lower, so it jumped up by whatever the numbers were. And so yeah, you pay that for life now.
So since we contribute so much money, can we have more control of where it actually goes and how it's invested?
No. No. If you're paying 50-50 and then you want to bargain half the governance, and then that comes with it a whole pile of other issues, then you've got to, that's another issue. But to come and say we'll pay more as if we can pick the investments, that's not likely going to happen. We're not investment managers, by the way. We don't, any of the funds I sit on, we don't, even the boards don't sit and say, buy Microsoft stock or buy Apple stock. We don't ever get into that sort of stuff. All you do is you set the parameters to hire professionals to do the investing.
That's why they have the risk.
Yeah.
They have the risk.
They
have the responsibility to.
They got a responsibility to stay within the mandates that we set out for them.
Should they be paid on the performance of the portfolio that they manage?
Well, in some ways that they do, because they get a percentage return. Like when you see a return, it doesn't matter if it's on your RSP or pension funds, is that the return is net, it's not gross. And so if a plan earns, if your RSP is earning 6%, you've paid that company that you're with 2.5%, so the fund earned 8.5%, and you get 6%, and they keep 2.5%. So the better the fund does, the more money they get.
When does the university have to stop these interest-only payments and start paying more?
Well, they're not paying any interest-only payments. As of when they do the valuation, as of July 31st, 2014, that takes roughly a year to do. And so it won't be until this time next year when they're going to say we're going to elect for 10-year, fund it over 10 years, or we're going to make interest-only payments for 3 years and then do the rest over the 7 years. So we won't know that for another year.
So if they don't know what they're going to do, this September when we're collective bargaining, how can they just demand increase in payments when they don't even know?
Because the solvency payments are a separate issue. Because what we're talking about here is the payments that we make towards the current service cost. And that's the sort of the government's push to go to 50-50.
So the only thing, if they want us to pay more, is the solvency directly.
Now, if they want us to pay more, it goes more towards the current service cost. It doesn't go to solvency.
Can I just check something, because I'm gonna have to go back to the office and report in. Okay. So.
Yeah, me too.
The current service cost is 140.7 million.
Yes.
And the employer pays 89.4 of that
Yes.
million, and we pay 51.3 of that million. And then you said 6.9 or something percent of our
earnings.
Is that in total? Does that include the employer part and the employee
No,
part? Or that's
ours.
So the people are paying 6.9% of their income up to
52,500.
Yeah.
This year, and next year it'll be a little higher.
and of that 6.9%, we've had an increase of 2.5 or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Okay, and then the the deficit mortgage, the 63.5.
Yeah, that's all. That doesn't enter into this discussion here.
No, that is what U of T is. That's the service debt.
That's the current. That's what's called the ongoing unfunded liability, and they're
Which
paying.
U of T is responsible.
They're responsible for it. They're paying $60-some million extra on top of their $89 million.
Yeah, and then if we had an economy next year where magically the interest rate went up and the investments were all yielding well and we had surplus, could the University of Toronto, I think I heard no, use some of that surplus to pay back the service?
No, because all that happens is they can't take a contribution holiday when there's a deficit. So all that happens is that they take a look and they now revalue the assets and liabilities, and that deficit may drop. But they still, the contribution holidays were used in the past to pay
programs.
Yeah, because that meant that there was no unfunded liabilities either on a going concern basis or a solvency. So they're using that surplus to pay their current service payments. So the cost of the benefits that you were earning this year.
Oh.
That's the problem with the pension stuff here, is that there's a series of different payments schedules that they have to make. And the plan has a deficit right now that they have to pay off, and they have a bigger solvency deficit that they're looking at and figuring out how they're going to have to pay that off for the future. I think that's it in a nutshell.
Everyone's an expert on pensions? We'll ask you to put away your pencils. We're going to have a quiz now. I'll invite, well, thank you, Alex.
No problem.
We're going to put it up on the website, so I can really